All right, so we're back on our lesson, on our series, Angels in the Spirit Realm. And so last time we met, we looked at the angelic hierarchies. We looked at the Christian or Catholic hierarchy. And then we also looked at the Jewish hierarchy. And so we kind of looked at how they each talks about the various beings, seraphim, cherubim, and they have an order or ranking of them. And then we talked about some of the qualities of each of them. And previously we've been going through a lot of them. We've talked about cherubim, we've talked about seraphim, we've talked about the angel of the Lord, we talked about the seven spirits in Revelations, about the four living creatures. And in the Jewish hierarchy, they had something called Elohim, which wasn't in the Catholic or Christian hierarchy. But today we're going to talk about Elohim, which is also generally in Protestants known as a different name for God, or one of the names of God. So we're going to explore that a little bit and explore what else there is to it and how it relates to the Jewish concept of it being spiritual beings, and how it relates to the concept of God, and how it relates to even more than both of those. All right, so today we'll be looking at Elohim. Elohim. Have you guys heard of Elohim before, other than the last lesson?
I guess the only thing I heard is that is the name for God, right? That's the only thing I knew.
Okay, so you heard that previously. Yeah, okay. Yes, that's generally it's generally what you hear, all you hear. Okay, so I'll start by reading, let's see. So I'll start by reading Genesis 1 through 4. In the beginning, God created the heaven and earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. Now, so you see, God is mentioned a lot of times in those 4 verses and throughout the first chapter of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and earth. It's the Spirit of God. And God said, "Let there be light." So everywhere the word God is there, that's actually the word Elohim. So that's the Hebrew word Elohim. So pretty much everywhere in Genesis, or at least the first chapter where it talks about God, it's the word Elohim. So in the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and earth. Now the earth was formless. The Spirit of Elohim hovered above the waters. Elohim said, "Let there be light." So that's the Hebrew word Elohim. So Elohim occurs 2,598 times in the Bible, the word Elohim. And so it's commonly known as you mentioned, a name for God. So it's a lot of times people say, God's name Yahweh, we call him El, we call him Elohim, we call him Jehovah, we call him, so it's usually usually referred to as a name of God.
In which Bible would you find those names?
You wouldn't necessarily find, so I mean, you'd find them in the Hebrew Bible.
The Hebrew Bible?
But you can use, either the NAS or the King James or whatever. If you look up the concordance, strong concordance, so if you look them up online or on a Bible app, if you look at the concordance and see what the Greek words are, they'll be there. So a lot of times God, if it says God, it was Elohim. If it's God in all caps, it was Yahweh, YHWH. If it says Lord, it may have been Adonai. So you won't find the word. They usually translate them to something else. If it says Lord, if it says, Lord Almighty or Almighty something, sometimes it may have been 2. So it may have said Elohim Adonai or Elohim something. And so the words are translated to something else for the English. And So yeah, so a Hebrew Bible would be where you find the actual words. I guess there are some versions that actually have it, and the versions that have it, yeah,
I'll research, no worries.
okay. And so we see that it has the I am at the end of it. So do you know what that means?
I am. Is it for he?
Well, no, because like we have cherub,
Oh,
we
I
have
am is
cherubim.
for the I am, right? Isn't it?
Well, no, the I am means it's plural.
Mm.
So like you have cherub is one cherub,
Mm-hmm.
cherubim is multiple cherub.
Mm.
Yes, seraph is one cherub, seraphim is multiple cherub. So you add I am on the word to make it plural. And so that's kind of the interesting thing about this word for God is that it's plural.
Mm-hmm.
And so this word is kind of unique in that in Hebrew, sometimes it's plural and sometimes it's singular.
Mm.
So when it's singular, it usually denotes the God of Israel, God. And sometimes when it's used in the plural, it's a plural of the word Eloah, and it's sometimes used to refer to the polytheistic notion of multiple gods. So like when it says, you shall have no other gods before me, it's Elohim before me.
Mm.
And so when it's used singular, it roughly means he is power over powers, or God of gods. So when it says Elohim, it's kind of translating it to God of gods. And when you do find it, the Bibles that do have it, if it's capital E, it'll be for God, and if it's lowercase e, it means it's plural for other beings or other gods, lowercase g gods. And also last week we talked about how in the Jewish hierarchy, they have Elohim as being a level of beings. So they have angels, then have Elohim below them, then sons of Elohim, then cherubim, and then Ishim, which are like men. So they have Elohim as being a class of spiritual beings. And so we'll kind of look at it and see how all that fits. See how all that fits in. So the roots of the word, so another name for God is El, E-L. So we see that's used often in the Bible, and it's one of the names for God, as well as Elo, E-L-O-H, is a name for God. And so El and Elo are used for not just the Jewish people God, but other gods in that area. The Semitic languages, they used El and Elo as well for the names of their gods. So Elo, the plural of El is Elim. The plural of Elo is Elohim.
Mm-hmm.
So Elo is. And so Elo is another way to say it is Elah. And then in Arabic, they contract two words, Al and Elah, and to put them together, and it makes Allah, which means one true God. So that's the Arabic name for God, and the Muslim name for God is Allah, which is Elah. It's the same Elo, it's the same word. Mm-hmm. So it's the same word they use there. So Elohim is used to refer to two ways in the Bible. So in one way it's used for God, and the other way it's used for other beings. So first we'll look at some examples where it's used for God. So you have Genesis 48:15.
Then he blessed Joseph and said, "May the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day."
So the word God there is Elohim.
Mm-hmm.
So it's Elohim there. So it's used to refer to God, Yahweh. You have 1 Kings 8:59-60.
And may these words of mine, which I have prayed before the Lord, be near to the Lord our God day and night, that he may uphold the cause of his servant and the cause of his people Israel according to each day's need, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord is God, and that there is no other.
Okay, so the people of the earth will know that the Lord is Elohim and there is no other. So you'll see that commonly talked about in the Old Testament that you know the God is one and there is no other, things of that nature. And so now we'll look at some of the other uses of Elohim. So I'll read Exodus 20:3. It says, "You shall have no other gods before me." So I'm sure we've all heard this before.
That's one part of the commandments. Right?
Yes, one of the commandments. So who is saying this? You shall have no other gods before me. So who's me?
That's God.
Right, that's God talking. So God, and that word God's there is Elohim. So God is using, who are the other gods, or what is he talking about?
The other small, lowercase
Right,
gods.
the other pagan gods that were worshipped. And so God is referring to them as Elohim. So it can't just be a formal name for God because he's referring to other beings as Elohim.
How did you come to that determination?
Well, God is saying, you have no other Elohim before me. So he's not talking about himself.
I understand that, but how did you replace the lowercase gods with Elohim?
Oh, you have to look. You can look in like a Strong's Concordance,
Oh, okay.
or I use So you could either like if you have a like Blue Letter Bible, you can click on the verse and go to Concordance, and it'll show you the words, or you can go to like Bible Hub, and then, or just So in the Strong's Concordance or the Hebrew Bible, look up that verse, and it'll show you what the original words are. Yeah. Yeah, good question. Good question. Yeah, so that's so God is calling them Elohim. So Elohim is used as a plural. It refers to, is similar to our lowercase g gods that aren't Yahweh, that aren't.
Yeah, well, in the Bible, I understand when you talk about the only one true God is capital letters, right? And then the other gods is in lowercase.
Yeah, that's
or
the
Lord, yeah.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah.
convention that we use in English. Yeah. So that's kind of important because there are some theories of people saying that every mention of Elohim is referring to God, so it must be more than one of them or something. But that's not the case. That it also refers to
But
other non-beings that aren't God.
Also in the Exodus 23,
Mm-hmm.
chapter 20, verse 3, I know that because I read it, it's the Ten Commandments that God is giving to Moses.
Yes.
So he's talking about himself and no other gods besides him.
Right.
Right.
Right. Okay. And so let's see. You have Psalms 86, 8 through 10.
Among the gods there is none like your Lord. No deeds can compare with yours. All the nations you have made will come and worship before you, Lord. They will bring glory to your name, for you are great and do marvelous deeds. You alone are God.
Right. So in verse 8, among the gods, so that word is Elohim, but that is the Elohim plural. And then in verse 10 it says, you alone are God. That's the Elohim singular. So David is saying, among the Elohim, though, there's none like you. So God, he's saying, that God is the greatest of the Elohim, the greatest Elohim of the Elohim. Okay, so you have Psalms 95:3.
Yes. For the Lord is the great God, the great King above all gods.
So the great God, that word there is El, El. And the great King above all, Elohim. So it's similar saying, Lord of Lords, King of Kings. So it's saying that God is higher than the other Elohim. So it's not saying that there aren't other Elohim, but it's saying God is greater than them. And so these verses let us know that there are other Elohim. But those Elohim aren't God, aren't God with a capital G. So there are other beings in the spirit realm that are referred to as Elohim, as the Jewish hierarchy suggests, but they aren't God. So now we want to take a look at, who are these other Elohim? So we're going to take a look at that and look into that more deeply. You have Judges 11:23 and 24.
Now, since the Lord, the God of Israel, has driven the Amorites out before his people Israel, what right have you to take it over? Will you not take what your God Shemosh gives you? Likewise, whatever the Lord our God has given us, we will possess.
Okay, so who is Chemos?
Another God.
Yeah, so that word there, Elohim, so you're Elohim Chemos. So saying, will you not take your Elohim Chemos? So Chemos is the national god for the Moabites. So the Moabites were one of the peoples around them, and their national god was Chemos. And so the Jews, so the Lord since the Lord, the God of Israel, has driven out the Amorites, possessed the land of Israel, what right have you to take over? Will you not take your Elohim Chemos gives you? So the Jews, we see throughout the Old Testament, they had turned to worshiping these other gods, these other Elohim. And so Chemos, so we actually see how that worship of Chemos got introduced into the Jewish religion, and it happened by Solomon, who was the wisest man alive, but then at his last days he became not so wise, I guess. And so, because he married, foreign wives who worship other gods, and somehow got caught up in it. And so you have 1 Kings 11:6-8.
Yes. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemos, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods.
All right, so there we see there's an Elohim Chemos, there's an Elohim Moab, and Solomon built sacrifice to them for the sake of his wives because they worship. So we see that Chemos was the detestable god of Moab, so he's the god of the Moabites, and Moloch was the god of the sons of Ammon, so the Ammonites. So we'll see that each of the ites, each of the different people, has their own particular god. So the Moabites had Chemos, the Ammonites had Molech. So each of the peoples had a different
There were a lot of ites.
Elohim. Yeah, there were a lot of ites. And let's see. Any thoughts? Any thoughts on this so far?
It's it's a lot to absorb because I have read, but then I've forgotten already what I read.
Oh, today?
No, it's been a
Oh, in
while
the
since
past.
I read.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
Yeah.
What gave the like Moab and Molech? How did they get their position as a god? Was that something that they kind of
Created.
They created. They just called themselves a god, and
No, no,
others.
no. Uh, we, I guess, create those gods,
Well,
right? It's just like when Moses was bringing the Israel out of Egypt, and then they said, okay, God is not showing. Let's bring all the stuff together and make our own gods.
right. So we're going to look at that. So we're going to get to that, but that's
Sorry.
actually no. That's a good question. So that's actually so that's commonly what we think. Is it okay? They created this idol, and then they worshipped it, but then if we think of so like the well, I'm going ahead a little bit, but so like the Catholics, they pray to Mary. So did they just create a woman and started praying to her, or was there
There was
a
Mary.
Mary
Yeah.
first, and they created a statue of it. So it could have been one way. It could have been one way or the other. So
Good.
the Jews have a concept that there are Elohim, are spiritual beings. So it could have been that their Moab existed, or it could have been that they just built a statue. So we usually think of it as, okay, they built a statue that just represented something they made up.
Well, it's almost like
So
if we go and make somebody a god, right? Like one of the good presidents from
Yeah.
the back, like Lincoln.
yeah, could be like that. Depends on if. Yeah. So let's. So yeah. So we'll get into that in
Sure.
a little bit. We'll get into that. You have 1 Kings 11:31, or who? Yeah.
That's
You have
one.
that.
First King 11, right?
Yes.
31, 33. Yeah. Then he said to Jeroboam, take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I'm going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, I will have chosen out of all tribes of Israel. He will have one tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of Ammonites, and have not walked in obedience to me, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my decrees and laws as David Solomon's father did.
Right. So we see again we have Ashereth was the goddess, so it was a female one. The goddess of the Sidonians. Chemosh was the god of the Moabites. Milcom was the god of the Ammonites, so they had another one. But so each of them was assigned to a specific nation. A specific groups of people had their own. And so in those days there were national gods, so each nation had their god, and so people worshipped national gods, and everybody worshipped their local deity, whoever their national god was. And then they may have worshipped somebody else's national god too, because we see sometimes in the Bible where God does something and the person say, well, I will worship your God as well. They'll say, I'll worship your God. But that doesn't mean, so we think of that, oh, well, they turned over a new leaf and now they're worshiping. But that doesn't mean they're going to stop worshiping theirs. It's like they just add, okay, now I add this one to it. That's why they were, pantheon, they worship multiple gods. So they're like, okay, I'll add this one to it. You know, they may have had a god of the water or a god of earth, a god of the air that they worshiped to, but they had their
Well,
own
just
national
like
god.
Catholics do, they worship Mary, they worship Saint Jude for this, Saint Anthony for that, so this one for because he's good for
Right.
putting people together. Yeah.
Yeah, so there may have been one for the so my crop will grow. There's a specific god or one god for this. Yeah, in those days. And then we notice in verse 31 it says, "The Lord, the God of Israel."
Right.
And so we'll get to that in a little bit.
Yeah, I noticed that a lot in the Bible, where there's the Lord, there's God with the Lord is God with the G capitalized.
Oh yeah.
And
So
we read it in a few other ones too.
Right.
Perfect.
yeah, and here though he's referenced. So there's like so.
The God of Israel, right?
Yeah, Ashereth was the goddess of Sidonian, which was a nation. Chemos was the god of Moab, and we're saying God was the God of Israel.
Right.
So he was over a nation as well, the nation of Israel. Okay, so now we'll get to the first part of the answer to your question. Were these just made up things, or did they represent something actual? Or did they represent some people, some king?
I think now that you mention, I thought people just came up with gods. You know, they just want to worship something. But you're right. There is people like Mary existed, and the apostles existed, and then people worship them.
Yeah, so that's what I thought. That's what I always heard, or that's what I'd always assumed until I did this study.
Mm,
And then
so interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
and this is the first new thing. So there's maybe two or three in here. You have Deuteronomy. Who has Deuteronomy? Okay, Deuteronomy 32:17. So it gets interesting.
They sacrificed to false gods.
So they is the Israelites here.
Which are not God. Gods they had not known. Gods that recently appeared. Gods your ancestors did not fear.
Okay, so this is saying the Israelites sacrificed to, so in other translations it says they sacrificed unto devils or demons, not God, which is Eloah there, to gods who them knew not, gods being Elohim, to new gods who came newly up and feared. So, yes, which version are you reading from?
Oh, NIV?
Okay, okay.
Let me read from
Okay.
another one?
No, that's good. That's fine. And, well, actually, so I'll read 1 Corinthians. So basically, so this is saying that the Israelites sacrificed to gods they had not known, and it says to demons, not to God, the gods they knew not, to new gods that came up newly, whom their fathers feared not. So now I'll read 1 Corinthians 10, 18 through 20. So this is Paul. He's talking about the same thing. He says, "Consider the people of Israel. Do not these who eat the sacrifices participate in the altar? Do I mean then that food sacrificed to an idol is anything, or that an idol is anything?" So he's saying, is an idol anything? Is a statue anything? He says, no, but the sacrifices of the pagans are offered to demons, not to God. And I do not want you to participate with demons. So he's saying this sacrificing to idols are actually sacrificed to demons. So these idols represent demons. So they represent actual spirit beings. So these idols are representing the fallen angels. So these gods, these other gods that they worship, are actual beings. They're fallen angels that are also referred to as Elohim. So these are the gods, lowercase g, are demons, are fallen angels. And so that is why God would always get mad with the Israelites. It's like kind of throughout the whole Old Testament, because every time he turned around, they'd go back to sacrificing to these idols, to these demons, in place of God. So they were sacrificing to, so each nation had a particular demon that it was sacrificed to.
We all should be ashamed of ourselves. Well,
Well, not us, we were.
we celebrate as pagans, like non-Christian holidays, like birthdays.
We do,
Valentine's Day.
but we don't,
It's like we're worshiping.
it's different because we're not specifically worshiping a demon. So people do it, people don't dress up and go to on Halloween and go to a party with the intent of giving honor to a particular demon.
Understand.
They kind of do it ignorantly, they just want to have fun, it's just like, oh, hey, Cinco de Mayo, it's time to drink. What is Cinco de Mayo? I don't know, it's time to drink. It's just enough, they do it just out of, it's just, but it's idolatry. So what is idolatry? What is the purpose of an idol? So usually when we think of idolatry, we kind of think about what you mentioned, that they built in a statue and they're just worshiping the statue. They just made up something. They built a statue and now they're worshiping it. But we see now that it's not, it was more than that. It's the same way, it's like when Catholics worship the statue of Mary, they're not just worshiping a statue. The statue represents an actual being that exists, that they're worshiping. So in the same way, when they worship the idols worship the actual demons that they worshiped. So they weren't just worshiping statues, they were worshiping, as Paul says, they were worshiping devils and worshiping demons. So idolatry in Wikipedia is described as the worship of idols, the worship of polytheistic gods by use of idols or images, the worship of created things, trees, rocks, animals, astronomical bodies, or other human beings, and the use of idols in the worship of God.
I guess I was even thinking of Exodus. You make something for yourself, an idol in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth. This Old Testament.
Right. It says do not make, and to worship it.
Right.
So to worship means you not just spend your time with it, but that you elevate it, that it's higher than you. You worship it, you give it praise, that this thing is higher than me. So I give worship to this. And so the idols that these people worship, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the purpose of idolatry is so that the purpose of idolatry was not just to let me have something to do. So they were worshiping these demons, and their purpose was to actually, they thought that the demon would come and inhabit that idol. They wanted to bring the demon down to inhabit it, and then the thought that with that they can either gain some knowledge or get some material thing or get the demon to do something for them. And so God said that he didn't want idols made of him.
He's a jealous God.
Well, he's a jealous God. He didn't want idols made of them, but then he was also different in that he didn't want idols made of himself either. So these other lowercase g gods had idols made of themselves and to be worshipped. And so that's how you know that they were fallen, because they allowed themselves to be worshipped. So God declared he wouldn't be localized. Don't make an image of him. And so he made it clear, and that he also made it clear that he was superior to these others. And so he did, though, allow them to make a temple and a tabernacle, which he would come down and inhabit. Okay. So then, kind of back to your question of how did they get assigned. You have Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9.
8 through 9.
Yeah.
So, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob his allotted inheritance.
Okay. So
Jacob his allotted inheritance.
Jacob his allotted in here. So Jacob is.
For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob his allotted inheritance. Okay.
So Jacob is. So this is saying. The Most High, so when God gave the nations their inheritance and divided up all mankind, he set up boundaries for peoples according to the number of, and some translations say the sons of Elohim. And so, and then it says the Lord's people were Jacob, so God chose Jacob. So some people interpret that as saying that the Lord gave the inheritance to, so we see each of the nation had their own God. And so some think that this verse is referring to that, and the Lord split up the people and assigned them their own gods. And he chose Jacob.
Say that again.
So when the Lord gave the nation their inheritance, so we see that the various ites each had their own God.
You mean the Moabites?
The Moabites,
Yeah,
the Ananites, the
There's also Reubenites. And
the Reubenites, right?
Reubenites is part of the tribe.
Well, no, not
of
the
Israel.
Reubenites.
So
Yeah,
that's why
they
I'm saying
share.
Not
So
all the ites.
No, not the Reubenites, but the other ites.
Benjamites.
The non-Jewish, the
Ites.
non-Israelites
Okay.
had their own. So everybody had their own local God. And so this verse is saying, when they split up the nation according to their inheritance of the sons of Elohim. And so each of these gods are referred to as Elohim. So when they refer to them, they're referred to as Elohim. But the Lord chose Israel as his people. Or he chose them out. So actually, I guess they had their own as well. So before God went to Abraham, the Hebrews were worshiping. I mean, they worshiped each other's gods as well, but the Hebrews were worshiping whoever they were worshiping. And then God chose Abraham and said, okay, I'm going to set you guys apart.
Right.
So all those gods you're worshiping, don't do that anymore. Just worship me.
He left Ur.
Ur? Oh, yeah. Before he left Ur. So let's see.
Why did he
Is
give
there
Jacob
anyone-
the highest inheritance?
That's I'm just kind of noticing that with this study. So there's somewhere. So he chose Israel. He chose from Abraham and that whole line. But if there are multiple verses that kind of allude to, he's saying, I picked that line because of Jacob. So, I mean, and he did say, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. So he specifically calls out Jacob as being who he loved. So, I don't know, there seemed to be something special about Jacob
Yeah, I was trying
that
to see
God
what was so
loves.
special.
So it's kind of like that. I chose this line because Jacob was going to be in this line. But I don't know more than that. That's all.
Okay, don't worry.
Isaiah 45, 4 through
Then
5.
that's me.
Okay.
45.
So that's actually what you were talking about, kind of.
Oh, okay. I'm always a little bit ahead, huh?
That's good.
Alright, I was just thinking.
Got a lot of prophecy going on here.
For the sake of Jacob, my servant, of Israel, my chosen, I summon you by name and bestow you a title of honor, though you do not acknowledge me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Apart from me, there is no God. I will strengthen you, though you have not acknowledged me. So that from the rising, I lose it. Okay.
Okay, so it's saying, again, for the sake of Jacob, I chose Israel. and give you the title and say, even though you don't acknowledge me. So, so even though they've fallen away, he's still going to bless them. And apart from him, there is no God. So again, emphasizing that, even apart from him, there's no God. So he's the highest God. He's above all these other created beings that they keep turning to. And so we know Israel was constantly unfaithful. Moses goes up to talk to God, and they build a golden calf for one of the gods, and they keep turning. And from the Tower of Babel up until around Daniel time, they just kept going back and going back. And okay, now we have Hosea 1 and 2.
1 and then verse 2, right?
Chapter 1, yeah, verse 2.
So when the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, "Go marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her, for like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord."
Right. So the story of Hosea, God told him to go marry a prostitute. And so he chose a woman prostitute and chose to marry her. And then she went and cheated on him. Then God told him to go get her back. And so he's saying that the reason for this is as an example of God taking back, for like an adulterous wife, the land is guilty of unfaithful to the Lord. So God was kind of showing them that you guys are unfaithful to me. You guys were out whoring with other gods, and then I came and chose you, and I chose to marry you. They were out, and he chose to marry them, and then they kept going back.
They still
And
go
then when God chased after them and got them back, and kind of like Pastor Brian said, the word, when God told him to go, when she left and cheated on him, God told him to go get her back. He said the Hebrew word to get her back was more than just get her back. He said it was not just go and snatch her and bring her back, but the word was like, it was to pursue, to flirt. So it was to go and pursue, he said, use example, he said, to go get your Mac on. So it wasn't just to go bring her back and say, oh, you cheated, I forgive you, but it was to actually pursue her. God told him to do. And so that's what God does to us. Even though we fall away or whatever, God still will come and pursue us. And he went and pursued Israel. So, and so we can see now that a lot of the struggle in the Old Testament, a lot of the story was the fact that Israel kept turning to these other gods, these other Elohim, and God kept bringing them back, or trying to bring them back, and trying to convince them that he was God alone and that he was higher than these other created beings. And so Deuteronomy 4:32 through 40 says, "Ask now about the former days, long before your time. For the day God created human beings on earth, ask from one end of the heavens to the other. Has anything so great as this ever happened? Or has anything like this ever been heard of?" So he's talking about his pursuit of Israel. Has anything like this ever been heard of? Has any other people heard a voice of God speaking out of fire, as you have, and lived? Has any God ever tried to take himself one nation out of another nation by testings, by signs and wonders, by wars, by mighty hand of an outstretched arm, or by great and awesome deeds, like all the things the Lord your God did for you in Egypt, even before your eyes, So he's saying, I did all these miracles, I did all of this stuff to go get you back. And you were shown these things so that you might know the Lord is God. Beside him there is no other. From heaven he made you hear his voice to discipline you. On earth he showed you his great fire, and you heard his words from out of the fire, because he loved your ancestors and chose these descendants after them. He brought you out of Egypt by his presence and his great strength, to drive out before your nations greater and stronger than you, and to bring you into their land, to give it to you for your inheritance, as it is today. Acknowledge and take to heart this day that the Lord is God in heaven, above and on earth below. There is no other. Keep his decree and commands, which I am giving you today, so that it may go well with you and your children after you, and that you may live long in the land the Lord your God gives you for all times. So Elohim is not a name, it's a title. So it's a title of God. It can be used in a singular noun, where it loosely means God of gods and refers to Yahweh, the God of Israel. When used in the plural sense, it refers to other spiritual beings, some of which became the pagan gods of the nations. Elohim are spiritual beings that know good from evil. They've fallen. They have the power of choice, and some of them have fallen. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that all of the Elohim have fallen. And so, but we know that the fallen ones, the ones that accept worship, have fallen. So idolatry was worship of not just idols, but actual spirit beings. After God called Israel to be a nation for himself, they were strictly forbidden from worshiping any of these other beings. There are many Elohim, but there is only one true God. He's the creator of all things visible and invisible. He's the only one that's sovereign. So back from the time of the Tower of Babel, various nations were worshiping their own national gods along with other gods. The Hebrews also took part in this culture. So then God chose Abraham to separate out a group of people to worship him alone. He gave them peculiar customs, traditions, so that they'll be distinguishable from other nations. You have a Sabbath, you must be circumcised. He gave them customs and traditions to make them stand out and be set apart. He commanded them not to intermarry with those who worshiped other gods in order to keep them from the idols and foreign worship from the household. The encounter with Abraham began God's plan to eventually bring all nations back to him. This was accomplished by sending his son Jesus to earth through a lineage of Abraham. Jesus' death allowed all nations to inherit the one true God, Yahweh, as our God. We now have the ability to not only worship God, but also develop a personal relationship with him. The pagans built idols and structures with the hopes of bringing their God down to earth. The Babylonians built structures with the hopes of reaching their gods. The Israelites built a temple in which God dwelt. We as Christians now have the ability to have God dwell within us. Mm-hmm. So let's walk in the way, let's seek the truth, and let's be the light. I think it's probably easier for us because in our culture, there being one God is the norm. So even whether you're a Christian or not, your concept of God is, when you talk about God, you think of one God. Even atheists, they don't believe in God. They don't believe in the one God. They don't say that I don't believe it. So even everybody kind of has a concept of God as one God. But back in those days, everybody had a concept that there are these multiple gods, because they're worshiping the demons. So we kind of live in a monotheistic world.
How God changed these people's names.
Yeah, God changed, and like when God changed
Even Paul.
Paul,
Saul.
well, I
He
don't know
changed
about
his
that one.
name.
Yeah, well,
No, because he was killing Christians under Saul, but under Paul, he was making Christians.
yeah, I've heard different things about that. Because I've heard, because it doesn't ever really say that, it never says he changed his name. You see, like, him reference, because it's like one is the Roman name and one is the Greek name.
Yeah.
But anyway, but he changed, like when he changed the Prince's name to the artist formerly known as Prince.